Hello and welcome. Today we're going to talk about navigating family dynamics. So, families play a crucial role in addiction treatment. First of all, they're an early detection. So, families are often the first people to notice changes in their family members, and they provide crucial context for crisis teams. So, talking to the family members, asking them those questions that we've talked about in past trainings is super important. They are the core support. So, in rural areas, families often provide essential emotional, financial, and logistical support. Community ties. Rural families foster strong social connections and advocate for those needs. So, the communities that these rural families live in often are strong connections for them. There are significant challenges, though. So stigma and isolation heighten reliance on family support in rural areas. So if stigma runs deep in around addiction in your rural community, then that can be really, really hard for people to reach out for help and add to the isolation that people are already feeling in rural areas. So when we think about crisis escalation in families, Um, let's look at what are some triggers that have to do with addiction. So, some of the most common ones are relapse following sobriety, substance uses, financial strain. So, that would be buying drugs or whatever that means for the person that's in that family. Um, and then often a large trigger is discovery of hidden substance abuse. Maybe people didn't know, and that can escalate families into crisis. Um, Things that cause escalation to escalate are co-occurring mental health disorders. So if someone is struggling with anxiety, depression, or even some forms of psychosis, this can make that addiction trigger escalate, right? Family history of addiction or trauma. So your father was an alcoholic and this was the result. Sometimes that can really escalate discovery of hidden substance abuse or whatever that means for that family. And then there's definitely a lack of support or treatment access in rural communities, and this can escalate the crisis more because there's not enough help out there, right? There's not enough community, there's not enough resources, and access to it may be very difficult also. So, abuse dynamics. So, addiction fuels conflict through heightened stress. Escalating tension breeds abusive behaviors, and then codependency perpetuates the cycle of abuse. So let's talk about the cycle of abuse. So tension builds, increased stress due to addictive behavior, some of the things that we talked about, but it could also be lying, financial strain. Um, there's normally an incident. So what happens is the tension builds until there's some sort of crisis, such as physical or verbal abuse, overdose, or some kind of destructive behavior. And then there's this reconciliation time where there's apologies or promises to change. And then there's temporary stability as family members hope for recovery. And then there's a calm. So there's a period of perceived normalcy before the cycle restarts. So then the cycle starts again, right? The tension builds, there's an incident, they come back together, there's promises of sobriety, and then there's calm. And we also see this in abusive relationships, or unhealthy relationships. The impact on the family. This cycle creates confusion and emotional exhaustion, normalizing patterns of abuse and addiction-driven behavior. So the first time this cycle happens, it's probably very scary. But if this cycle happens 20 times, it starts to become normal. And these patterns of abuse just become how the family starts to work. So, cycle effects of the cycle of abuse. So, the immediate effects, there's an emotional toll, right? So, there's guilt, anger, fear, and hopelessness among family members. Behavior responses. So, after this cycle of abuse happens, there's normally hypervigilance. People will be on the watch. maybe for drug use or whatever the incident was. There's enabling. So people just want to fix other people, and we'll talk about that. Or there's withdrawal. The family members kind of move apart. They don't talk to each other. The safety concerns are risk of harm to self or others, especially during acute intoxication or withdrawal. The long-term effects are emotional and relational. So there's a breakdown of trust, communication barriers, people stop talking, and estrangement. Maybe they don't talk to each other at all. Impact on children. So exposure to chaotic environments can be really dangerous for children and can often lead to neglect or trauma. Economic strain. So costs of treatment, costs of substance use, legal fees, or lost income due to substance use are all very, very intense long-term effects. So I want to talk a little bit about the creation of unhealthy family roles, which can be a result of this cycle of abuse. So we'll see codependent behaviors, enabling or rescuing behaviors emerge, blurring healthy boundaries within the family dynamic. So people really want to save people who are struggling with addiction. Let me help you. Let me give you money. Let me get you into treatment. A lot of times, what that person needs is to figure it out on their own. Because if they're not ready, treatment's not going to happen or it's not going to stick. Parentified children. So children can take on adult responsibilities depending on how addiction looks in your family, whether the parent is addicted or the child is addicted. Um, these shift in roles that children often have to take on, it it messes with their development trajectory and they can lose their loss of self. There's many things that can happen as a result. Power imbalances. So authority figures within the family may lose influence, creating confusion or conflict about decision making and leadership. So authority figures often take a back seat, and these parentified children can come in and they're the ones that are the authority figures or running the household. So the parents often will lose almost their credibility to the child, and the child then is the one that's making the decisions and running the house. On top of that, there's an emotional strain. So shifts in boundaries can disrupt established support systems, leading to stress, resentment, or role-related fatigue. So being a caretaker or of someone else's children or constantly being hyper vigilant for someone else can create emotional strain and boundaries to shift. And these really often create unhealthy systems. So these are some of the unhealthy family roles. I'm going to talk a little bit more about codependent behavior because we see a lot of it in addiction. So let me talk about the definition of codependency. It's an unhealthy reliance on controlling or fixing the behavior of the addicted individual to maintain stability. A lot of times, too, codependency can look like I can only feel good if you feel good. And that's really dangerous because we can't control how other people feel. So if we're constantly trying to fix someone to put them in a better place so we feel better, it's very dangerous. So common behaviors are enabling. So covering up substance use, providing money. So we're trying to enable them to get better. We think that we're helping, but we're really enabling them to use more. Excessive caretaking. So this is, all right, I'll clean up your mess. I will get you into treatment. I will send you money. Lots of things that excessive caretaking can look like. Neglecting personal needs for the sake of the addicted individual. So instead of taking care of myself, instead of exercising, instead of eating healthy, I'm going to make sure that you don't use. Maybe I'll follow you around. Make sure, talk to your friends, tell them not to send you money, not to sell you drugs. So oftentimes when we are trying to protect a person that we love through codependent behavior, we aren't taking care of ourselves. Impact on family dynamics perpetuates unhealthy patterns. So codependency can make this create these areas where we don't have healthy boundaries with other people. And they can often, this estrangement can happen. We're not respecting our own boundaries, therefore, we're not respecting theirs. It prevents accountability for the addicted individual. So if I got a DUI or someone I love got a DUI and I went and saved them, whether it's to pay all their legal fees or hire an attorney for them, then I'm not letting them take accountability for their actions, their consequences. They're not seeing their consequences. And sometimes that is the biggest way that we can help people who are suffering from addiction see the addictive patterns and the unhealthy behaviors is by letting them be accountable for their actions and allowing them to have these negative consequences. Codependency really, really provides a safeguard for negative consequences, which can be very unhealthy. Okay, so signs of codependency. So there's emotional indicators. You may feel anxiety, guilt, or fear tied to the addicted individual's actions. Maybe you're afraid they're going to use, or you feel guilty about your parenting, or in another role, maybe it's your partner and you feel anxiety about them going to work because you don't know if what's going to happen. Are they going to use? Are they going to, if you're not constantly surveying them, what are they going to do if they're not under surveillance all the time? Difficulty separating one's self-worth from the success or failures of the individual. So if my child doesn't make it through treatment or they relapse, I'm a terrible parent, right? So how do you separate yourself from their success or failures in this journey of addiction? We'll talk about that. Behavioral indicators. So overcommitment to solving the individual's problems, and this is kind of similar to what I was talking about with the DUI, and trying to solve those problems and not enabling or caretaking behavior. And then what often happens is resentment or burnout due to unreciprocated efforts. I just paid all this money for you to get your DUI taken care of and you're back using. Or now I've been fighting for so long for you and nothing gets better. And you start resenting that person or feeling burnt out because you don't see their progress in your eyes. Communication patterns that can be dangerous are avoidance of conflict to keep the peace. So I found that they're using again, but I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to disrupt the peace, right? So it's almost this level of secrecy in order to just keep things toxic. Something I always found really interesting in AA, they talk about you're only as sick as your secrets. I always found that very interesting. Lack of honest conversations about addiction and its impacts. So if we're constantly caretaking, we're constantly trying to cover things up, there's no level of truth or honesty here. And we're hiding from the actual impacts. And that can be super toxic for families and super toxic for the codependent people that are perpetuating it. Okay. So now let's talk about something that's really important for people struggling with codependency and unhealthy relationships, boundaries. So what are boundaries? Personal limits that guide how we interact with others, protecting our well-being. Okay. Why are boundaries important? They prevent burnout and help families and helpers have healthier relationships that ensure professional conduct for helpers. And we'll talk a little bit about that. All right, so we're going to watch a video on setting boundaries.
Imagine you created a beautiful garden, but you notice people walking through the grass, littering, or even picking the flowers you've grown. So you put up a fence to mark what is your space, and you now decide who can come in through the gate. This is how we would protect our garden, and is also how we should protect ourselves by setting boundaries. Boundaries are limits we set for ourselves within relationships, be they romantic, professional, friends, or family. You want to clearly see where you end and someone else begins. I describe boundaries like a roadmap of me showing you how best to have a relationship with me. It is me clearly expressing and communicating my values and preferences because I want you in my life. Some examples of boundaries are physical boundaries. what you are comfortable with in terms of your own space and your own body. Emotional boundaries, what you are comfortable with sharing and what you would like to keep private. And time boundaries, how you would like to prioritize your own time and where you would like to take time to rest.
An example of a request would be, please stop raising your voice. An example of a boundary would be, if you continue to raise your voice, I'm leaving. That would be me clearly expressing my thoughts and feelings, being aware of what I'm responsible for, and being aware that I don't need to explain my no.
Boundaries are something that everyone can benefit implementing in their life because they not only protect our time and energy, they also protect our relationships. They prevent miscommunication, misunderstandings, and build up resentment. But what about when someone doesn't respect a boundary?
What's often difficult for people is what to do when somebody violates or oversteps a boundary. And if we use the earlier example that if somebody was to raise their voice at me, I am responsible for protecting myself. A lot of people fall into rescuing or fixing the other person, whereas that is up to me to protect myself. And if you continue to raise your voice at me, I leave.
If you feel like you need support, please contact your local mental health services.
Okay, so we learned a little bit about setting boundaries. And I find that in order to set boundaries, I have to first know what I need. And once I know what I need, I can set those boundaries. And then holding those boundaries can be very difficult. So you have to really look inside of yourself and think about how can I keep myself safe, not the other person. And I think that this video did a really good job talking about that. So as healthcare professionals, we have to learn how to establish boundaries with our coworkers and our clients. And so today we're going to talk a little bit more about how do I establish boundaries and how does this work out in the helping field? So start out with the first step, self-reflection and assessment. We identify personal limits, reflect on what behaviors you can tolerate and which ones are unacceptable. So this can be a time of self-exploration, and these boundaries can be really difficult to understand, these limits that we want to put, like, is it okay for someone to raise their voice at me? Is that all right? In what circumstances is that okay? And how do I respond, right? And then once you kind of look at that and what that looks like for you, then you ask yourself, okay, what are codependent patterns that I'm doing? So I need to assess any enabling behaviors that may inadvertently support the addiction. So maybe I think to myself, well, if they're using or if they are suffering from mental illness or in these conditions, it's okay for them to yell at me. The truth is it's never okay for anyone to yell at you, and that you always need to put your safety first and yourself, right? So if you think about this from that perspective, then I just recognize the codependent behavior in myself. I was caretaking, right? So define clear and specific boundaries. So behavioral expectations. Specify acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. So maybe one is no substance use in the home, right? You want to look at what is acceptable for you and what is not. Communication norms set guidelines for respectful communication, avoid abusive language or actions. So, what does that look like for you? Is it okay for someone to cuss at you? Is that okay for you? What does that look like for you? And our boundaries might be different between you and your coworkers. What you think is appropriate and what others think is appropriate is very going to be different, right? So that's why it's important for you to understand what's appropriate for you. Financial boundaries determine the extent of financial support, if any, to prevent enabling addiction. This is more of a family type of boundary, but something important to think about. So the next step is to communicate the boundaries assertively. So we want to use I statements. Express boundaries using statements like, I feel, let's say, sad when you cuss at me. And I need you to use different words, right? So use I statements, express boundaries using statements like I feel emotion, when behavior happens and I need the boundary, right? The point is to be direct and compassionate. So clearly articulate boundaries without aggression, ensuring the message is understood. Sometimes if we come at people from an aggressive place, they won't hear us because their trauma gets triggered. So it's really important when we're setting boundaries to have that clarity in ourself and have the calmness. So holding boundaries. Implement consistent consequences. This is really important. So establish consequences. Decide on appropriate responses if boundaries are violated. You could leave the situation, right? Maybe you say, you give a warning and then you leave the situation, or maybe you just leave the situation. Follow through. This is important. Consistently enforce consequences to maintain the integrity of the boundaries. So only enforcing the boundaries here or there or one time is not enough. Consistently enforcing them is where the growth happens for you and for the addicted individual. Be flexible and reassess as needed. Monitor effectiveness. So sometimes we can put up a boundary and it's not effective. It's important to look at that boundary and then ask ourselves, is this boundary getting the effect that I want? Or do I need to reevaluate it and make adjustments as situations evolve? So this is an ever evolving process as relationships and people are. Adapt to changes. Be willing to modify boundaries in response to positive changes in behavior or new challenges that arise. So if someone stops cussing at me and I have put up a boundary around cussing, I think you can rework that, say, and look at what is a new boundary that needs to be put up around a different behavior, or maybe they're doing something else that needs to be looked at. So it's a constantly evolving process. All right, so we're going to look at how this might look in the field. We're going to talk about Mary. So the mobile crisis unit is dispatched to assist Mary, a 39-year-old woman who has been struggling with opioid addiction. Her husband, Tom, reports that she frequently asks for money to buy groceries or pay bills, but often spends it on substances. Tom is overwhelmed and says, I can't just say no to her. I feel like I'm failing as a husband. Mary has become defensive and withdrawn, refusing to discuss her addiction. The crisis team's goal is to help Tom establish and hold clear boundaries that support Mary's recovery while maintaining their relationship. All right, so let's talk about establishing boundaries. So step one, identify the need for boundaries. So here's the team action. The team speaks with Tom to explore the patterns of enabling behavior and the emotional toll it's taking on him. Team member, it sounds like you want to help Mary, but giving her money may be supporting her addiction instead. Setting boundaries can be an important step in helping her and protecting your own well-being. Outcome. Tom acknowledges that his actions, while well-intentioned, may be enabling Mary's behavior. So there's the first step, right? So what is going on inside of us and why are we doing it? Step two, establish clear and specific boundaries. The team action. The team guides Tom in defining clear, actionable boundaries. Team member, what do you think you can do to help Mary without enabling her? For example, instead of giving her money, you could offer to buy the groceries yourself. So here's an example of a boundary. I will not give Mary money directly, but I will provide food and other essential items as needed. And this could also look like a gift card to Safeway, right? Because we know where the money's being spent. It doesn't mean that she won't spend it on alcohol, but there's ways where you put up boundaries around money so that you're keeping yourself safe and that person safe too. So the outcome, Tom agrees to communicate this boundary to Mary in a calm, non-confrontational way. Step three, prepare for boundary communication. So the team practices with Tom how to deliver the boundary, and practicing how you're going to say it and what it feels like. Actually, even though sometimes it seems a little weird, it can be super helpful in giving us the courage to actually say these words. So here they are practicing. Team member might say, When you speak with Mary, try using I statements to avoid sounding accusatory. For example, you could say, I've decided I can't give you money anymore, but I'm happy to help in other ways, like buying groceries. Outcome, Tom feels more confident in having the conversation with Mary. Okay, so now we're going to talk about holding boundaries. Step 1, reinforce the boundary when challenged. So Mary asked Tom for $50, claiming it's for medication. Tom's response, which was coached by the team, I understand you need help, but I can't give you money. I'm willing to help you get the medication directly if you'd like. Outcome, Mary becomes upset, but Tom stays calm and reinforces the boundary. So he's still offering her access to the medication, but he's making sure that she's not spending it on other things. Step 2, address emotional manipulation. Mary accuses Tom of not caring about her. If you loved me, you'd trust me with the money. Tom's response, I care about you deeply, and that's why I need to stick to this boundary. I want to support you in a way that helps, not harms, because giving her that $50 could be harmful, right? Outcome, Mary reluctantly accepts Tom's response, and Tom feels reassured in holding his boundary. Consistently enforce consequences. Step 3. So here's the scenario. Mary continues to pressure Tom and becomes angry when he refuses. This is what the team would say, maybe. The team advises Tom to set a consequence for repeated violations. Example, if you continue asking me for money, I will need to step away from the conversation until we can talk calmly. Outcome, Tom steps away when Mary escalates, showing that he is serious about his boundary. So sometimes you have to put boundaries on top of boundaries. Outcome. Over time, Mary begins to respect the financial boundary and accepts help in other ways, such as Tom buying groceries. Tom feels more in control and less overwhelmed. He's able to maintain his emotional well-being while supporting Mary's recovery. So this is best case scenario, right? Boundaries are important. So if we look back, we want to think about figuring out what a boundary looks like for us. What do we want our role to be? How do we say that boundary in a kind way using I statements? How do we hold that boundary? We reevaluate the boundary, right? Make sure it's working. And we continue to make boundaries around this depending on how the person responds in holding them. We just have to be really careful about control, because if we really try this controlling aspect of, okay, I feel in control, I'm controlling the money, that can lead to unhealthy behaviors too. So we don't want to control people who are in addiction, but we want to control our behaviors and understand our own emotions. Okay, debrief discussion. How did Tom establish clear and specific boundaries? By identifying behaviors that enable Mary and defining alternative ways to provide support. What strategies helped Tom hold his boundaries? Using consistent communication, calmly addressing emotional manipulation, and enforcing consequences. How did these boundaries benefit Tom and Mary? Well, Tom maintained his emotional health, and Mary received support without enabling her addiction. All right, so key points from today. The role of families in addiction. Families provide critical emotional, financial, and logistical support during addiction crisis, especially in rural areas. The cycle of abuse and recovery. Addressing the emotional toll of addiction and abuse helps break harmful cycles and fosters long-term healing. Codependency and its impact. Codependency can perpetuate unhealthy patterns and emotional strain, hindering both individual and family progress. Establishing and holding boundaries. Clear and consistent boundaries prevent enabling behaviors and support recovery while maintaining healthy family dynamics. All right, I hope this was helpful. Thank you.